Hello, everyone. It's Chris Kapchis, president of Chestnut Real Estate. This is our second podcast.
Wow.
Doug Gubitz and I, and Doug will comment in a moment. During our first podcast, as you know, Doug, we talked about what's happened to the real estate market since 2020, beginning of the pandemic. We thought we would provide a kind of an overview so people had an understanding as to how we got to where we are now with sales declining, increasing, now declining again, average sale prices declining, increasing, and now declining again, and the various issues that are kind of affecting the market as we sit here and speak. But before we get into our first topic today, I thought, Doug, because of course our podcast is called
Real Estate Decanted.
Real Estate Decanting. And
Decanted.
Decanted. Oh, I thought we were decanting it.
Real estate.
We are
decanting.
decanting it.
Then it should be decanting real estate.
That's why I said decanting real estate.
No, you said real estate decanting.
I'm sorry.
Yeah. It's
okay.
If you want it your way, it's decanting real estate.
Okay. Our podcast is Decanting Real Estate.
Okay, there you go.
But before we get into our next subject, I thought Doug should explain, because as you can see, we have some wine decanting on the table here. This is an amazing wine, but it's only a 2016.
That's correct.
And I think Doug should very briefly explain why, after he once again introduces himself, as to why we're drinking such a young Bordeaux.
Okay, that's a very interesting question, which we've already discussed, and I'm happy to share this with you again. So, Bordeaux wines generally from France. I'm not an expert, but I'm a consumer and an enthusiast. Generally speaking, Bordeaux wines, you start drinking them at 10 years after the vintage. That's been the protocol forever. But, you know, Bordeaux and Burgundy and Italy and all the other Western European wine producers are struggling to compete with New World wines, as you said. Mm-hmm. And they've had to, change their methods and change their marketing and produce wines that are more approachable, younger, because it's difficult for people to hold on to a bottle for 10 years. As you and I have discussed numerous times, I think 99% of all wine consumed on this planet is purchased the same day it's consumed. Mm-hmm. And if you think about, small condos, which I think we're going to get into very shortly, this is the segue.
That's the segue.
Who's buying a couple of cases of wine and putting them in their 629 square foot condo to sit on it for 10 years before they drink it? It's financially not doable, and B, logistically and physically not doable. So even though the old world of predominantly France and Italy are stuck on their old ways, they have to be commercially reasonable and make money. So they've started to produce wines. It's not a new trend. It's been the last 20 or 30 years. Wines that are more approachable earlier to compete, essentially. I mean, that's what this is. It's competition. So great houses like Chateau Montrose and Saint-Estèphe in Bordeaux produce a second wine or a younger vine grape that generally, amongst other reasons, are consumable and enjoyable at an earlier age. So we're looking at this second wine of Chateau Montrose in only 8 years, and it's just bloody delicious.
And we have tasted it before this podcast, and it is delicious.
It could use some food, of course.
Of course.
But since this is decanting real estate, we had to have decant some real estate. There it is.
And actually, speaking of decanting real estate,
yes.
And Doug alluded to what we're going to talk about, and both Doug and I feel very strongly about this, and I think it's important to anyone that might be watching this podcast, and generally in terms of what's happening in the real estate market, and that is what has happened to the condominium market. Size, investors, all of that, because it is really impacting the condo market today as we know it. It's the weakest sector of the real estate market. Not only are average sale prices for condominium units down, but sales are down dramatically as we speak. And we're obviously in the tail end of 2024 as we do this podcast. And I think, Doug, you should give us some of your views on that, because I think it's become a crucial component of the resale real estate market.
You know, I think you could look at if you just use the downtown core of Toronto as the study for the purposes of this discussion. And you and I have talked about this endlessly. What's happened to the landscape, the physical landscape in Toronto? For argument's sake, for all intent and purpose, it's really
That's a subject on its own, and I don't want to really get into that.
I get that, but
because
it's from
I've
Bloor
got
Street
some
down.
negative views, as you know.
I know, but I'm going to counter some of those negative views.
Let's hear them.
Well, we're going to talk about those now or not. But
Let's
okay.
stay with the subject.
So there has been so much criticism of what's happened to the downtown landscape with these massive glass and steel towers that are anonymous, aesthetically uninteresting, and not appropriate for the demographic and for the population. As you talked about so many times in our office meetings and in our last podcast, the enormous influx of immigrants into Toronto is being housed in these glass and steel towers. And are they really appropriate for a city to be housing people in investment commoditized small condominium units? Is it healthy? Is it family oriented? Is it growth oriented? What does it represent? What are those condo towers that we are putting up at a breakneck speed? Of course, not now.
Well, a critic would say that they're just simply a manifestation of developers and builders and investors making money.
I think a lot of people take that position. And I've had a rethink about this. I'm not so sure that is actually accurate. And it's easy for us, all of us, to blame the greedy developer to just put up the most expedient, anonymous tower as quickly as possible to make the most amount of money. But in fact, that's not really what's going on. There is a collision of circumstances and factors.
I know, but developers will tell you that they're not in the business of solving Toronto's or the GTA's housing issues. They're in the business of making a profit.
You're absolutely right. They will say that. But they've also been given that. That football's been handed to the developers by government, who dropped the ball in the 60s and 70s.
We're going to have a few podcasts on government.
I know that, but as you have pointed out so many times, the government was deeply involved, particularly through CMHC, in the 60s through to the late 70s, I believe.
I was there.
I know you were. So that's why I know so much about this topic, how intimately involved the federal government through Canada Mortgage and Housing Corporation was involved in housing Canadians. That, for one reason or another, and you'll have to dive into that one, was stopped. And instead, governments just passed the ball to developers, to the private sector.
Correct, to the
and
private
said, you
sector.
know what? The private sector can manage housing. We don't have to do it. Let them do it.
And that is exactly their position.
Okay, but why?
It was easy.
What flipped the switch?
It was easy.
Why were you so invested in it at Canada Mortgage and Housing, and then you weren't?
Well,
what was the dynamic that happened there?
Do we want to get into that period?
Right.
I think we're
I just
off-
want to know why
off-
they stopped. Why did Canada stop being involved in housing Canadians and turned it over to the
It was
private sector?
expensive. It was expensive.
Okay.
It involved taxpayer money, and it became politicized. Some of the things that Canada Mortgage and Housing Corporation was doing, like the MERD program,
Yeah,
and
multi-unit
probably most people
residential.
are not aware of it. There were tax benefits to various.
Tell the audience what that is, a MERB.
Well, for example, in the
It's an
MERD
acronym, right?
Yeah, it's an acronym for multiple unit residential program.
Building.
And we were building, and we were building using the private sector as well. But essentially, there were condominiums that were investment vehicles for various people in Canadian society. But they included people like doctors and lawyers and accountants and people who had some excess money that were able to invest in these properties. And they had some tax breaks if, in fact, the rents that they were generating were insufficient to meet their operating costs.
So a joint venture between the private and public sector.
Correct. But various political parties felt that some people were benefiting at the expense of others. Mm-hmm. And that's only one example of a program that was killed as a result of that. But it provided housing, and the housing that it provided was much better than those little boxes in the sky that you and I are criticizing.
I think there were MURBs, multi-unit residential buildings,
Correct.
MURB, townhouse complexes as well. If I
As
remember.
well, absolutely.
Yeah. There are even some in the city of Toronto.
Correct.
Broadway and so on, for those of you who are from the city. There are those
Correct.
ultimately were sold.
Correct.
Built as MURBs and then sold into the private.
So get back to what we're talking about here.
So, I mean, it's, I think, in my rethink, I was one who blamed the quote, greedy developer to get in and out as quickly as possible for the most amount of money. And that vehicle was the smallest possible unit, right? If you need 70% of sales in a 400-unit condo building before you can break ground and get financing, well, your shortest path or your quickest path to that is smaller units, because
Correct.
there's more people who can afford smaller units
Correct.
than they can bigger units. So that's the easy cop-out thing. So we'll just build a bunch of small units, get our financing, and go.
Because just to be clear, some people may not be aware of the fact that unless you get buy-in to the extent of about 70%, in some cases 80%, you can't get your financing in order to go forward with your project.
Yeah, pre-sales we're talking about.
Pre-sales.
You have to pre-sell 70% of the
Correct.
building, at least.
So if you don't get that, your project's not going ahead.
Right. And you've invested huge amounts of capital to get it to that point.
Right. So obviously, if you're building 1,500 square foot units, it's going to take longer to get those pre-sales. And as a result of that, you're not going to get your financing, and maybe your project doesn't go ahead.
Correct.
So again, it's a systemic issue, and we haven't even talked about investors, which we will in a second, that also drove that 70-80% pre-sale process.
And then we input the foreign buyer ban, and that conspires
Where
to...
that, I want to talk on that.
You do.
Yes.
Now?
No.
Fine. So there has been a lot of criticism levied on developers for making these 450, 500, 525 square foot apartments, which others call purely dormitories for foreign students, for young startups in Toronto. How does that develop a city? And where do you go from there? Where does somebody who's owning or renting a 500 square foot apartment go if their jobs are downtown, for example? So all of these things have been kind of focused on the developer, and they're the fault. It's their fault. That's why we have tens of thousands of 500 square foot apartments that nobody wants. And today is a great example.
Correct.
Nobody wants those anymore.
Yeah.
They're even becoming a little bit difficult to rent,
Yep.
predominantly because we've cut back on student visas, which dominated so much of that rental market in the U of T and et cetera marketplace. But it's not as simple as it sounds. This is my newfound reflection on this. Why do we have, first of all, why is there enough demand in Toronto for that number of high-rise condo
Well, I think
towers?
you've just spoken to that.
Immigration.
Yes.
Okay. So, but what about the immigration? Is it ownership immigrants who are going to come and buy one of those units, or are they just going to rent one of those units?
Well, for the most part, we know that these condo units that we're talking about, these so-called boxes in the sky, were primarily purchased by investors.
Correct.
A lot of them being overseas investors.
Correct.
Foreign investors.
Yes.
And for those that may not be aware of this, we have a foreign buyers prohibition at the federal level. We also have a 25% foreign buyers tax at the provincial level. And that combination has effectively taken the investor out of the marketplace.
Right.
And with the investor out of the marketplace, we no longer have the 60, 70, 80% pre-sale buyout of these projects. And as a result, they're not going ahead. I mean, there are other factors. Our interest rates are high. We talked about interest rates in our first podcast that reached the Bank of Canada rate 5%, which made financing one of these projects and financing a purchase of a unit unfeasible. So that's why, in fact, I have with me the August market data, and condominium apartments in the city of Toronto, their sales are down by 14, almost 15% compared to last year, and average sale prices are down by 6%. They have declined dramatically. Freehold seems to still be holding its power, detached, semi-detached townhouses, but not condominium apartments, for the reason that you mentioned, that investors are not only not coming into the market, but investors that were in the market are finding now that their units are not feasible economically anymore, and a lot of them are being dumped onto the market, adding to the huge amount of supply. Almost 40% of the supply in the GTA now is condominium apartments.
So what could have been done? I know the answer.
You know the answer? 'Cause,
I have a theory on what could have been done.
well, let's hear that theory.
I don't think anything could have been done. And I come
Well,
to
you know, that's a courageous statement to make, because that's the part that bothers me about
I
politicians.
thought you were going to say it bothers you about me.
No, about politicians, is they don't have the courage to say that they don't know what to do. And as a result of that, they make these legislative decisions that kind of try to micromanage the market, and in particular this market, to no effect or to negative effect.
Okay.
But what's your theory?
Well, back to our good old market-driven forces. Why is it that we have sufficient demand in a proper market, in a good functioning marketplace, not a marketplace like now? Let's assume the interest rates did not go up, and these condo developments would just continue in almost perpetuity being created. Swinging cranes, at one point, there were more cranes swinging in this city of Toronto than anywhere else on the planet.
I think that's still true.
That might be the case. But this insatiable demand from an investment perspective is obviously matched by a rental need demand. And we can't ignore that. So let's assume we blame the developer and say, you know what, the reason you've made such a mess of the downtown core is because all you did was build these 500 square foot apartments. And now we mandate you instead. From a government perspective, you ask the government, do something. Like we need an answer from you. We're looking to you, municipal, provincial, federal governments. Do something about this. We've got to stop this madness. Okay, so we mandate, and they've tried to do this a little bit, but we seriously mandate larger units. If you want to develop, you want to get a permit to build a 70-story tower in the city of Toronto, it has to have 30% three-bedroom units and 40% two-bedroom units, and so on, to make.
But at least more than 1,000 square feet.
Oh, then they have a minimum
Because
standard.
they're doing some three-bedroom units at
900 square feet.
to 900 square feet.
Right. So let's assume the government did all that. What would happen? What would be the ultimate outcome? Do I believe?
There'd be no building.
There'd be no building because they wouldn't be able to sell them. The land is so intensely expensive now. Why is it intensely expensive? Why is downtown land so pricey? It's because of the demand.
Correct.
From the world. This city has been discovered. The world wants to be here. Accordingly, the land in prime downtown locations becomes disproportionately expensive. Can you really sell three-bedroom units at 900
Well,
or
someone
1,000?
would argue that if government, particularly at the municipal level, were to reduce development charges, because 25 to 30%, some cases even more than the cost of a new unit, is development expenses.
Correct.
How much could we bring that down?
Other jurisdictions eliminate them entirely.
Correct.
Okay, so we could chip away at this, But currently, if you use the City of Toronto,
I believe that they're using those funds, the development funds, for other revenue purposes other than just infrastructure and
schools, roads,
Yeah.
water service, yeah, they're siphoning off money for that to use for other government needs, deficit predominantly. Fine. But if you use the City of Toronto guideline now, as part of their development standard, at 1,141 square feet for a 3-bedroom unit, what would that look like at $1,400 a square foot? Given all the development costs, land costs, supply chain problems, worker, finding
Well, the problem, Doug, I mean, I think
$1.6 million.
yeah, which you could get a semi-detached
There
property
you go.
in one of the more sought-after neighborhoods in
Right.
in Toronto.
Because in that 1,141 square feet, let's think about that for a minute. Let's assume we did mandate that, and a lot of them, at $1.6 million, to your point, that's what it's going to be. Even if we can nibble away at it with development costs being reduced, et cetera, and get it down to 1.4 or 1,450 instead of 1.6 million, you're still not going to attract an audience to it. 2 of those 3 bedrooms are going to have no windows. Will have a frosted glass wall.
Correct.
Yeah. The kitchen will be in the living room and dining room. It'll be a wall with the oven opening up against your back of your couch, and you're going to raise a family there for the rest of your lives. You're going to spend 15 years there. And have your kids at schools there that probably don't exist. It's all concrete. There's very few parks. It's not a place where you're going to raise a family.
It's a very discouraging
It
conversation.
is, but it's in defense of the developer, because I think we all want to blame the greed of the developer on how these buildings got built with so many small units. But I think that blame is misdirected.
I think we may have to take a break, Doug, because I think we need to think about solutions to this.
Oh, my
And at
goodness.
our next podcast, that's what we should be talking about, because we've put information out as we see it, but it's actually quite a negative piece of information that we put out there. And how is this city going to improve? Yes, we're in this situation. Where do we go from here? How do we get out of this
It's
situation?
an excellent question.
That's what I think we should put our heads
And do you
together.
think we have some solutions to that?
I think we have some solutions. I don't know whether they're all-inclusive solutions, but I think there are solutions that at least should be looked at. Because one of the concerns that I've had, and maybe we can conclude this podcast with, is I just think there's been a lack of cohesion between the various levels of government to deal with these issues at the federal, at the provincial, at the municipal level. And I think you need to approach it inclusively at all of those levels.
So a lack of dialogue between the various levels of
100%.
government?
Yeah.
You think that's
and
one of the
on
bigger
top
issues?
of that, I think not only do you need the government, but you need people who have experience with what's going on in the industry to be part of that dialogue in order to come up with solutions as we move forward, so that we provide housing that people can actually raise families in and be in for literally a lifetime if necessary. And at the same time, we do it at a price point that enables them to get in there. Otherwise, we're going to continue to build these monstrosities that you have been describing, and just making our city not the city that we loved and admired, and the world loved and admired.
It was much more livable at the time.
Correct, and it's no longer the case.
I think there are very few people who would argue that we
No longer the
we have
case.
maintained a livable city. The solution idea is an excellent one for a future podcast, but I think we've come full circle, and the argument that we're going to probably the conclusion we will likely reach after we flesh out some ideas, which is I think it's a great topic, is probably going to revert to the European and Northern European model.
Yeah, and I have a couple of
And that's social housing.
yes,
And it's going to come full circle to that.
and that's what used to happen at the beginning of your conversation. You talked about CMHC. CMHC was
Social housing.
deeply involved in social housing, nonprofit, co-ops, and that's stuff that we'll talk about.
You can't bring in 500,000 people a year and not deliver social housing.
And more,
it won't
actually.
work. Yeah,
And
and
more,
more.
and more.
So that'll be the conclusion, but I think it would be very good to
Yeah.
dive
Now, you want to
into
tell
it.
me if that wine has
Well, you tell me. You're-
sufficiently opened?
Well,
and,
what are you? Because you're very
has
sensitive to that.
decanted? Because we've been trying to decant
I'm
the real estate market. So
Look, can we first settle on the name? It's Decanting Real Estate. That's the name of this now.
Okay.
Decanting Real Estate. You're much more sensitive with your little sensitive tannic tummy to tannins, so you tell me. Still smells good.
oh my God, I can only say that it's a shame that whoever is watching this cannot taste what you and I are tasting.
You can tolerate that tannic?
Oh my God, it's amazing. Thank you,
there you
Doug. Thank you.
I was going to
Okay.
bring, by the way, before you close it off, I was going to bring the 08 Domaine de Chevalier, which you adored, but we need food with that.
But maybe another podcast,
I only have one bottle left. So if we're going to have dinner at the podcast, yes.
perhaps.
Okay.
Thank you, everyone.